Native Americans all up and down the Great Basin would burn pretty much everything at least once a year. And they would use these fires for two purposes. One, of course, to drive them. And when you drive these bison off of even a low cliff like this, you know, it might only be 6 or 8 feet. You're still going to cause every now and then one to break a leg or roll over, or at least slow down as he tries to swim away. And of course, they're there with their atlatls to dispatch him. So they have one group driving the fires and the other group waiting for what was left and for the kill site. So they were, in essence, harvesting bison. This was a ranching opportunity. These were their slaughterhouses. All of the Great Basin was basically a large bison ranch maintained by a person in innumerable different cultural groups. It was ranching on such a vast scale that the people who came, the Spanish and later the Anglos, of course, looking at it, couldn't understand what it was. They were just wandering around killing bison, and actually it was quite I wouldn't say an organizing, well, for any cultural group, it was organized. They knew exactly how to do it. Let me show you a little bit more about it. But first, what we know from ethnography from people who watched this, there was a French castaway that told the story of being captured and on a bison hunting expedition with the Akwokisa. And they went from living off of shellfish toward the end of the year, towards the, December in that area of time, they would go inland to look for bison. Why that time? Because the bison in the wintertime would come toward the coast looking for green grass as it started to freeze in the inland. And the wind would be blowing from the north. That's when we start to have these northers, which is perfect for driving the bison. And where were they driving them to? Let's have a look. But anyway, just to mention cocoa, we're doing that here. And the bead-eye who lived on the Upper Trinity, we're doing that in Limes Prairie. And the Katonkawa coming all the way down the Colorado River from Austin, and that area, Austin, San Antonio, we're doing the same thing. And some of these areas, those groups were in conflict. So what I'm going to do is take you to a blow up of this area here, basically surrounding with Fort Bend, Richmond in the middle here. And we're going to take a look at a site called 41W. That's just call it Site 19. That's just archaeology speak. And so here we are, the Brazos River in the middle, Blue Star, that's where we are in Richmond. And you can see all these red dots. Now, there's a lot of red dots along the rivers. You expect that. They come up in their canoes. And by the way, in the fall of the year, they could stay up along the edge of the forest and feast off of pecans while they're waiting for the bison to come. So, the perfect place to be. But then you see all these sites that are in the along the bayous. And again, this is White Oak Bayou, this is May Creek, this is Buffalo Bayou here. And you see these things, they're like catcher's mitts pointing up to the north. Same here, this is West Bernard, this is the San Bernard River and West Bernard Creek, making kind of a V there. And these groups were lined up along there, and the bison were coming in. As I mentioned, they were driven by hunger. They were coming to the coast as the freezes started. And these guys were waiting. And all you had to do, imagine it like a large pinball machine. The ball comes down, and there's all these places where it can get hugged. Why? Because the bison were plains animals. They didn't like to be in forests. So as soon as those forests were around there, they kept going east, but they kept away from the forest line and those trees. And that took them deeper and deeper until finally at the end of the funnel down here, that's where the Native Americans were waiting. And that's where we find the archaeological sites. There's three in particular. The richest ones were White Oak Bayou, where there's quite a few remains were found in the 1970s excavations of bison that had been killed in gullies along the creek, just people on top of the gullies shooting down at them, and then slaughtered in place. Then Upper Buffalo Bayou, same thing. This is right around between Barker Reservoir and the Barker Dam and Addicts along there at Terry Hershey get down here in the San Bernard area, San Bernard Prairie, lower San Bernard Prairie, I'll show you this one a little bit more detail. Now, before we go there, though, just think about timing. This was something that was great. They saw them do this in historic times, but the archaeological sites go back 12,000 years. So you see the little circles are just showing you what ages. This is about 13,000 years ago to about 400 years ago. And you can see that many of these sites, like along here, up there along Cypress Creek, along here, that people came back to the same place time and time and time again. What that tells you is it was a great place to set up your slaughterhouse. And so that's in essence what it was. So now what we're going to do, that little red square there, that's where Site 19 is. We're going to blow that up a little bit and talk about the sites that are there lining that's Peach Creek and then East San Bernard Creek, I believe. Sometimes my geography leaves me. Anyway, this is what it looks like, and I've got them labeled here. So it's West Bernard Creek, sorry, and this is the San Bernard River. This is during Hurricane Harvey. The reason I put it on there is because the dark area is where the water went. So that kind of tells you where things are low. And these were the places where all those archaeological sites were. And what would happen would be they would drive these things into these cul-de-sacs where there was no way out. It was forested on all sides. You see where B is here, there was only a narrow entrance. Once they're in there, you could, of course, put some brush along here, and then you've got them bottled up, and you can just kill them at your leisure. They don't want to go into the forest. Now, on each one of these promontories here, you can see them here, and here, the lighter color. Those are sandy knolls. And I'll take you to one of them. And what was happening there was that each one of these knolls, at the ends of those pink arrows, was a kill site. There was an archaeological site there. And that's those sites that are there, around there. So what was happening was this. This is that one in particular that I just circled. The high prairie is to the left. It goes for miles. And then all of a sudden, there's about a 50-foot drop-off, very steep, into West Bernard Creek. The archaeological site is just around the corner on the left side. They would have been waiting here, and as soon as they came down, they would be raining death on the bison. Here's kind of an artist's view of what it would look like. Plenty of room for those bison to be falling. And they would have kept this burned off most likely. All that Yopon patch that was on there that you saw wouldn't have been there at the time. So, if you will, a bison abattoir. This is a map here that shows you where archaeologists have found bison bones in pink and deer bones in yellow. You'll notice there's not much up there in the piney woods. They weren't forest animals, so why would they be there? Where they were along the prairies. That's the San Bernard Prairie, the Cave Prairie, and then opening up into the great, vast coastal prairie. The other thing that we see at these sites, besides bison bone and that sort of thing, are knives. These are about yay big or so, and they would be much larger than an arrowhead or anything like that, or a dart point. They would have been used for processing hides, for skinning, basically. So you find them also at these sites, and not so much up at the piney woods, for example. The other thing that's fascinating, I find anyway, the other thing you find at these sites is a lot of fired balls of mud, about the size of your fist. Red, you can see some red coloration in them, colored like bricks almost, and some black that showed you they were burnt and fired. What was this all about? Well, what you find typically in an archaeological site, this is up at Diamond Knoll, which is near Highway 99 at Cypress Creek. Anyway, they excavated a few years ago. They could find these things in what looks like about a wheelbarrow size indentation into the ground. and it would be full of these baked clay mud balls. And when you look at them closely, and you look at the side of the indentation in the ground, the wheelbarrow size of the pit, you'll notice that the sides of the pit are not burnt, just the clay ones. So clearly, they weren't building a fire inside there and making an earth oven, at least here, at other places. But this was not an earth oven. It was kind of puzzling. A guy by the name of Michael Collins, a famous archaeologist up in Austin, kind of figured it out, as some other people up in the north figured out. These are historical era Assiniboine tribe up in around the Canadian border. What they would do in historic times would be when they kill a bison, they would take the skin and line a pit with it, and they would have a fire next to it where they would be heating up. Well, they had plenty of rocks, so they didn't have to make mud balls. They had plenty of rocks, and they would heat these rocks up, and they would put in the pit there anything that they wanted to cook immediately that was soft and was going to spoil. Blood, for example, tripe, for example. You said it might make something like a menudo or something out of it. And they would drop the rocks into the liquid, and that's how they would get it to cook. So that's what we see. Now, why did they do this? Well, pottery, there was no pottery here until about 100 AD. So for 12,000 years, as they were killing buffalo every year, there was no pots, no cooking pots. So they had to be invented, and this is what they invented. It lasted for, like I said, for 12,000 years. No, I should say 10,000 years. Okay, now let's take a bigger helicopter look at this bison hunting business. And this is all of course, eastern half of Texas. You can see the Louisiana border there, and the piney woods on one side, central Texas. This is satellite data. The dark green are forests. So you can see the Great Plains of Texas in between the two main forests. The purple there is basically the Balcones Escarpment in central Texas, which has in it a beautiful chert supply called the Edwards Chert, which the Indians love for points. So that's why I colored on there so you can not forget about it. So anyway, we have two forests, prairie and savanna in between. And as the bison were coming down, basically this funneled them as they were heading toward the coast. That's why this was such a rich place for these Indians to be waiting for in their hiding places to kill them. Now, what we need to think about here for a minute, and that's this term refugia. Right now we're in the middle of a drought. It isn't as bad yet as the 2011 drought was, but it might get that way. And you remember what that was. Trees were dying, and it was just awful. Well, you imagine back in prehistory, anywhere in the plains in between central Texas and the piney woods, that would be just sunburned, nothing to eat, hard to find anything to drink. The streams would have dried up, awful. The bison aren't coming down into that. They're staying up in the Midwest. Heck with that, there's nothing to eat down here. So you'd have this hot, dry time, and it might last. Paleoclimate climate data shows many, many times in the last 10,000 years where you might have droughts and conditions like that that last 100 years. So you have to have a place for your cultural group to live. Where are you going to live, and what are you going to do? Are you just going to leave completely? Well, no, they didn't have to. So what you had to do was to retreat into a refuge or a refugium, of which, for example, along the Balcones Escarpment, you've got all those springs. And those springs will have alligators, they'll have turtles, they'll have fish. You can live up there and make a living for a long time until the bison come back again. And that's what they would do. And the people that work on arrow points, and sorry, I should keep saying that, projectile points, because these were not arrows, they were throwing sticks, darts. Anyway, there's particular types of dart points that are associated with these peoples that were living along here. And the interesting thing about it is that one type might only be found in like a 500-year interval. and then there would be nothing for a while, and then there's another type. And so what was happening was that there's no need for them. In the time in between, there was no bison to hunt. Why would you make a point that long, to hunt fish? You don't need it. So they would forget, and they would have to make it up again, how to hunt a bison, how do we do that? And they would come up with a new point on that when the next wet time came. So anyway, you have these that are from those people. Now, let's go, so when wet times came, they would leave their mountain fastness and they would go out into the plains and wander all over looking for bison. Now, East Texas, similar type thing. Here you have the Trinity, the Neches, the Sabine. Each of these also has springs that feed it. They don't dry up during a big drought. So there's water, there's catfish, there's alligators. There'll be deer feeding off it. You're in the forest. So you'll live off of those, and of course down by the coast, you still have shellfish and the like to eat. So you're living good. You're just living along those, and you saw how these rivers were just lined with those archaeological sites. And of course, when times were good, everybody wants to eat bison burgers, so they would be leaving and going out into the plains as well. So the types of points that they had, Gary, Kent, Girardeau, a whole bunch of different types, distinctly different than those. And you would find them also out in the plains, meaning these people were coming out there and they were hunting. Then South Texas, similar thing, this third type of refugium, would be the bays coming into Matagorda, Corpus Christi Bay, those various bays. Rivers like the San Antonio River, which is spring-fed at its source, would still carry enough water down there where you could just barely make a living. It wasn't rich like these other two revitalized, but they still could do it. Those would be the ancestors of the rock down there. Okay, and also then they also would move up. So if you go to an area like Site 19 that we just looked at, you find evidence of all three traditions at that one site. So what was happening was that they weren't working together. It's just that we're talking about a long period of time and a vast period. One year this group might be over here and this group over there, and the next year it might be reversed. And over time, over the thousands of years, you'd find all three types of pits, arrowheads, in the same location. Okay. All right, that's enough on the bison. Gives you an idea at least of the bison hunting people and what they were doing around it. Now we're going to look at an area here, this so-called Bowser Mound, which is called the Lower Brazos Mortuary Culture. Not very exciting title, but it says that there were people who were distinct living along the Lower Brazos and Colorado, and I'll show you why they were distinct next. Let's see now. Yeah, these are things that came out of the excavation that Paul was on back in 1996, and that came out of a burial site. One was an absolute gorgeous pendant necklace made out of the shell. Actually, all these are made out of the shell of a shell called, you'd know as lightning bug. It's called Bisicon perversum. And there's pendants. There were gorgets. You go around your neck like collars like this. And then beads made out of the columella, the central column. And why is it called perversum? Well, these are the Bisicon perversum is the only one of the many whelk species that instead of turning to the right clockwise as you're looking at it from above, it turns to the left. To Native American peoples, this made it sacred. And you'll see their attraction for using this for ornaments and ceremonial items and whatever is, everyone thinks pretty clearly was related to this feeling that this is something that made its own path, it was something different. And that's kind of an age-old thing that would attract people. Other things at the site were, as you can see, there's some points there, various types, as I mentioned. Shark's teeth, showing you they came from the coast. bone awls, that long one up at the top, very common in South Texas and into Mexico. Then these projectile points made out of deer bones. They're in the center there. And those are interesting, but the really great stuff is there's several different things. One is boat stones. These boat stones were found associated with pebbles on a corpse. There would be cup-like things, and the pebbles would be underneath it. And there have been a lot of ideas about it. A lot of ideas on the ones up north, which are shaped a little different. They thought might be atlatl weights, so some give you heft to your throwing stick. But these are way too fragile for that, and of course the pebbles wouldn't go with it. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. But some of these boat stones don't come, or rock types that don't come from here, and they came all the way from the Ouachitas. We'll talk about it in a minute. Then there are these corner tang knives, much bigger than the knives I was talking about a minute ago. Some of these knives might be this long, made out of chert from Central Texas, Edwards chert. They had a tang or some notches on the top, thought to be for like a thong you could tie around it if you're using it to slaughter a buffalo, a bison. Then there's going to be a lot of blood and fat and whatever, and it's greasy, and that's a prize knife. So they might have something tied on it. If you drop it, it's tied on your belt or whatever, so you would lose it. That's one idea, probably the best idea. Then probably most interesting of all was this copper awl here. That copper, we don't have copper like that in Texas, other than a few other archaeological sites I'll show you in a minute. This one has been tested, chemically tested, isotope chemistry. And it comes all the way from the Great Lakes, and I'll show you in a minute. So these people were getting around. So the question, who were they? Who were they related to? And who were they trading with is the next question. So let's dig a little deeper. This is in late Archaic time, so more or less the time of Christ, if you will. These cemeteries are shown here in red. As you see, there's a whole number of them along the Brazos and Colorado. Some of those have evidence of violent death. That's the yellow lightning bolts in the graves. That's kind of interesting because then you can get some, if you look at somebody that has an arrowhead buried in his breast, you might be able to tell a little bit what refuge the guy came from, who the murderer was, or where he was. And then sites with marine shell ornaments, you can see that almost all the cemeteries had marine shell ornaments like I showed you, but there were other sites that were not associated with cemeteries where they're actually manufacturing these things for trade. Let's see, one other thing I forgot to mention. Now on the other side of the river, this is the Brazos, and then there's Caney Creek or whatever, but then you're out of the Brazos drainage system and you're into the San Jacinto drainage system where the Akokisa were. And here at that time, there were no Akokisa at the time. These would be their ancestors most likely. But the blue dots are showing where there was early Chifuncta pottery, which came in from Louisiana. It was along the Sabine around 70 AD and got to around Houston area around 100 AD. At this time, it hadn't gotten down here. These guys had no ceramics. So cemeteries, no cemeteries. Marine shell ornaments, no shell marine ornaments. Marine shell ornaments. Pots, ceramic pots, no ceramic pots. So you can see this is kind of like a long-standing cultural divide here. And in fact, this is where Cabeza de Vaca landed in the 1520s. And those of you who know your Texas history know he had two groups. One was the Han and the others were the Coahuilcas. And they lived along Willis Island, but each spoke a different language. One on one end of the island, one on the other. And basically, he was seeing the dividing line between these two cultural groups. Okay. Let's see, did I go the wrong way? I did. Okay. So I mentioned the manufacturing sites down there. So basically what they would do is remove panels and make pendants out of them, remove the central column, and make beads out of those. All right, And I mentioned the violent deaths. That's the little red circle, the red dots with the lightning bolts. There's, I can't remember how many, like 15 or 18 of these corpses that were like this. And what you see is a count of which types of points were made, and I've color-coded them. The green ones were from East Texas, what I call the Trinity Sabine culture. And then the red ones were from Central Texas. And you'll notice that none of them are from South Texas. So you get and a few of them are not recorded. So you get the strong idea here that the people on the receiving end of it were the people whose area this was. And that was the basically Paleo-Coco they appear to be. So this is one of these fellows with 3 Girardeau points in his breast. Pontchartrain points in his breast. There. Okay. Now, let's use some of this data information to figure out what was going on, and let's look at regional locations of some of these things. We'll start with the easiest one, which is the corner tang knife. It's found in the Great Plains, all of them. The biggest concentrations are along the Balcones Fault, it's the edge of Central Texas, and that's where the chert was that they were making. And they both traded up in here, but most likely also roamed up there hunting and taking these things with them. You'll notice that they didn't trade them into the forested eastern U.S., where these various Hopewell, Adena, and Glacial Canes cultures were. This is what we call the eastern woodlands cultures along the Ohio River and the upper Mississippi River drainage basin. They didn't trade up in there. There was no need to use these things to kill bison in an area where there wasn't so many bison. So, okay, so that we can kind of understand that pattern a little bit, that they were coming out of East Texas, they're going in and they're hunting, and some of this got down here into lower Brazos culture. Now let's talk a little bit before we go any further about Bowser Mound itself. This is a LiDAR, 4-bin LiDAR data of this. This is, if you know where Bowser Road is, this is Bowser Road here, and it's off to the west. This is Pool Hill, the southern part of Pool Hill, which is only about 25-foot high hill. And then you have this mound that doesn't seem like it relates to anything out in the middle of, basically out in the middle of nowhere. And it's about 8 or 10 feet high. And the other thing that's interesting is right next to it is an old swamp, slough, I guess you call it. Up until the 40s, it was a wet place, and in the 50s, some farmers drained the swamp by putting in this drainage ditch here, but we luckily have some photographs of it when it was basically a swamp with all sorts of creatures in it. That makes you start thinking, because if you've ever spent any time in Mississippi, Louisiana, looking at some of these old mound sites, what you see is that whenever you have a mound, like this is the Marsden Mound, right next to it you will have a swampy low area, which they call borrow pits. The reason they're called borrow pits is they had no metal shovels or anything like that. They were digging with basically the shoulder blades of bison, whatever. So you wanted soft soil to dig. And so it helped if there was some wet place. And when they found one, they just made that wet place bigger and bigger and took the sand or dirt or mud or whatever it was and started building the mound. In most cases here, these were burial mounds. So they were burying their bodies in dirt. They would just take baskets full of this stuff and bury it up. And over time, it would make a sizable mound. Here's another one. This is Cypress Grove Mound in Louisiana. Same thing. You can see the borrow pit and you can see the mound. Here's some more mound built in Alabama. You see the mounds, and then you see the low place there where they would have dug it out. Okay, so what about the timing on all this? If we take a look here, this is just a time chart, and here's our guys over here. There's an early and a late culture. This is time over here. That's AD, BC, so time of Christ is 0 there. That would be here. The upper ones had all the grave goodies. The lower ones, they were buried in the cemeteries, but without grave goods. So it was kind of a religious difference that happened along that border. But anyway, if we project that on to the east, we can go to Oklahoma, where we're talking about the early predecessors of cattle culture called Fushmaline. In Louisiana, this is what they call Chifunta and Marksville cultures. They had pottery by this time. Then over here, further up into the Ohio River Valley, would be the Hopewell, Adena, and Glacial Canes. Some of these you may have heard about before. But these were mound cultures, all of them. And except the Glacial Canes, which is a slightly different situation. So let's start with the Glacial Canes, the earliest of them, about 1100 BC to 500 BC or whatever. They're all along a certain part of the geology, and that's where they find glacial canes are sandbars left by retreating glaciers. And so the people back then said, oh, great, I've got this sandbar. It's above ground. What a good place to bury Grandpa. And so, probably Pop back then. Anyway, so they had graves in those and started doing ceremonial burials. This is what a glacial cane looks like, kind of about the size and shape of our mound. Then the Adena culture came, and it pushed east into the Ohio River Valley, as you can see, all the way up into the Great Lakes there. And these folks, it's about 500 BC to about 8100 or so. They also had mounds. You may have seen pictures of some of the more spectacular ones, but most of them were about this size here, and again, burial mounds. Why were they not in the glacial canes? Because they ran out of glacial canes. They didn't have any more. Geologically, that was the end of it, so they had to make their own canes, if you will, and they did that by digging. And then finally, the Hopewell culture. I'm sure you've heard of that in history classes and whatever, around AD 100 to 500. Beautiful, inventive stuff, beautiful ceramics associated with people. By this time, they'd moved out also into the Illinois and upper Mississippi River basins, as you can see. And these are some of their things. Some of them were spectacular platforms, ceremonial platforms, but many more were small burial mounds of the type that we have here. Okay, so now I put all of these mounds of these ages on a map. And you'll notice here that we have some in our neck of the woods too. There are mounds of this age in the first Marine culture in the lower Mississippi Valley and in East Texas, and especially now the lower Brazos culture, the mound that we're just talking about. It is the southwesternmost of these mounds that we know of. Okay. All right, so what I'm going to do now is start looking at these artifacts. Let's start with these marine shells. They live on marine areas. You can't find them inland. And look at the distribution of these ornaments. You find them in central Texas along this end, the escarpment, and then in coastal Texas where they were making them, as I showed you, including the lower Brazos culture. And then we find them in the Fushmaline guys had them. And then all the way up into here, there's just lots and lots and lots of these buried with people that were distinguished with these gorgets and pendants. So where do you find this econ along the coast? Anywhere it's pink on this map. But the thing is that none of the other groups east of here used ornaments and made these types of ornaments. So they didn't come from here. Now think about it. You're sitting up here on Lake Erie and you want one of these things, okay? It came from Texas. These are from Texas. So we have there's a woman, a professor at the University of West Virginia, whose specialty is these. And we sent her some pieces of ours, and she's trying to do some chemical tracing with them. But I think the map itself speaks volumes. That what was happening was they were, of course, making them at these sites that are those white stars there, and then pushing them upriver into these areas in here. So long distance trade of things coming from Texas. We're talking 2,000 miles. If we look here, I've just circled 3 areas to show you some of these so you can compare. The ones from the Bowser side are on the left, the pendants and the gorgets. And the ones at the Birch side, that's in Michigan, and then these over here, which are all the way up in Ontario, and there's not a dime's worth of difference between them.
Could you tell the timing, like how long it might have taken to get, or is that something you're
Yeah,
doing?
these sites here are the same age. That's why I was showing you the Adena, and so these would be Adena and Glacial Canes age sites.
Right, but we don't have any idea how long it would have taken to get from the Texas coast up to the Great Lakes. I mean,
No, but not very long. If you remember that.
when you say not very long, relatively speaking, I mean.
A few weeks.
Really? Oh, okay.
So when LaSalle was this was before he came to Texas, he worked his way down the Mississippi River and then had to walk back. Then it took him, I don't know, a couple months, maybe, something like that. Yeah. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Just a little bit about the religious side. These were spiritual symbols all the way up until modern times. And you can see, for example, this guy with the gorget there, made strictly out of Visicon perversum. And if you think 2,000 years, that's a stretch for them, these Native Americans to be holding on to one religion for that long. Well, think again. You know, we've been wearing crosses and stars of David and that sort of thing around our necks for the same amount of time. So not at all extraordinary. Okay, copper ornaments. Now, I told you about the copper awl. These are awls that are very similar to the one down here in Bowser site. This is up in the Birch side in Michigan. These are up along Lake, that's Lake Erie, I guess it is, Eastern Lake Erie at the Picton side. So in green, the green stars are the places where these copper artifacts have been found, and they're all up and down the same area. If we go to this is a site in the Ouachitas in southwest Arkansas, and here's some of the copper ear pendants that came from there. These are some of the Visicon gorgets and beads that were found there, and I'm just about now to get into talking about the lodestones that were from there that are also very similar to what we have at Bowser. Remember, these are the sites, these are the ones from Bowser site. These are from others. This is the Albert George site, just east of here, found in the 50s. The Vitt site is in Austin County, very similar. And the interesting, this one and this one here are made of a particular rock type called Nepheline cyanide. And why is that of interest? Well, there's only one place in North America to get Nepheline cyanide, and that's in the Ouachitas, where there's 3 stalks, igneous stalks of this stuff. That's the only place you can get it. Well, let's take a look here. This is a map made in the 30s, by the way, which I've just added to, showing where all the boatstones, these boatstones have been found. And the biggest concentration of them is in the Washtenaw Mountains of eastern Oklahoma and southwestern Arkansas. Now, I mentioned these ones that are made out of Nepheline cyanide. There's the place where the cyanide outcrops are. And here are all the places, including several in the lower Brazos culture, that are made out of Nepheline cyanide that absolutely, positively came from those cyanide outcrops. So there was trading going on from that cultural center, probably a religious center, down into our area. So it would have been most likely a religious center of some sort. That is pre-Caddo, of course. Just those 2 black circles there, just showing you the ones from East Texas. That's from the Bowser side, and Jones Mounds in East Texas, Southeast Texas. And this is up in Ohio. And you see the same shapes, the use of the pebbles, that sort of thing, very, very, very similar.
Why are they called boatstones?
They thought, the early archaeologists thought they looked like boats. And some of them actually even have what looks like a keel on it, but they don't know. It's that. I'll show you some thinking of what they might be.
And these were at the burial site?
Yes, these are all from burial sites. These here were made out of copper, by the way, but the same shape. Very thin, very graceful stuff. Now, this is some of Paul's work from I don't know, is Is your artwork still that good, Paul?
I didn't have a lot of time to do that.
Well, lucky he made the sketch, because what you can see on here is, first off, that's where in this particular body, that's where that busy comb necklace came from. And you can also see in green there those beads, those are columella beads. And then there was a bone pin here, and then a whole bunch of bone items along his pelvis. And those were associated with those three bone stones, inverted with the pebbles on the underside. And if you look at the hands. His right hand is your typical position down by the side. The left hand is over his pelvis, over the area where those bone stones and those bone items were. So it doesn't take too much of a stretch to realize that he's holding on to some sort of a sacred bag or medicine bag, if you will. Those were sacred items. And this was a man, not everybody gets pendants like this. There were only two of the Bowser site that were full necklaces like this. So he was a man of quite some stature. We don't find bone stones today, but in Mississippian time, that's only maybe 500, 600, 700 years ago. They were using turtle shells and putting gravel inside them, drilling a hole in it, putting it on a stick, and you had a rattle. And today, the contemporary Creek Indians still use those. They put rattles in there, and then they put those big groups of those in along women's legs, tied on women's legs when they're dancing. That gives kind of a rattle sound. So we kind of think that that's probably what this was. There were some sort of rattles. They would have had a piece of rawhide over the cover. It would make something like a drum. Certainly the use of the gravel suggests that. Now, we've talked a little bit about the distribution of those things. And I just want to say something now about how they would have made that, to your question, how they got there and how long it took. Those are rivers there. These people all had canoes. Once they got up there, they would have been using rivers. This is the, here, I'll just use my pointer here and we'll get right to it. At Cape Girardeau, Missouri is where the Natchitoches Trail takes off. It's an old very famous Native American trail that goes all the way to Natchitoches, Louisiana. It comes down into Arkansas. That's the Natchitoches Trail. It goes right through the area of the Sinai. Then it comes further down and becomes Trammell's Trace as it heads into Texas and joins into El Camino Real. So probably this would have been a northwest-southeast route, starting in Mexico and going all the way up into the Great Lakes. The Brazos River cuts across it. Our guys were living on the Brazos. It was no big deal for them to take their canoes up to the area, nearest access point to the trail system. Now these are all three of those items, Boatstones, Copper, and Busy Con, all on the same map, and you can see they're mapping the same area, and here would be that route, and basically coming down something like that. And it's kind of interesting, not at this time, but a little bit later. So you're talking about overland and then canoe, basically. We know that this route lasted for a long time. Corn made it to our country around 1000 AD. That corn didn't come from here, it came from Mexico. So that was a route that brought corn up there. And if you look at pyramids, Mexican pyramids, the oldest pyramids of that type, made out of earth, were up along the Ohio River, 1,000, 2,000 years earlier. So it could be that the technology and the idea of making platform pyramids like that actually came from the U.S. down. So we got the corn, they got the pyramids. But all this happened after the time we're talking about. Now, okay, finally, let's just wrap this up and talk about how did this happen? There's a set of stories that the Muskogee Indians who lived along the Alabama-Mississippi border, they were uprooted by Andy Jackson and forced to move into Oklahoma, but some of them stayed behind and hid in the woods. And they maintained their culture and their customs and their language and whatever. They had in their myths, or if you want to call them their stories, their tribal stories. They talk about a group called the Hopewell, I haven't said that right, I'm sure, but it lived up in the Milky Way, and they call that the Celestial Path, the White Way, Great White Way, and that there were different cultures living along parts of the White Way, and the Hopewell would go along and basically keep the peace between these warring factions. As you know, in North American Indians were always at war with their neighbors. There was just constant warfare, noticed by everyone who came in the area. Of course, a lot of times the settlers would use that to their advantage. Well, anyway, that was their thought. But they also had some people on the ground that did the same thing, and they were called the Isnissa. And these guys were trader diplomats. They traveled on earthly white roads, trails, trade trails, and they were free from attack. They could go anywhere. And they were acolytes of sacred knowledge, and they were peacemakers. We know what they looked like because they described these people as having wearing white, carrying a basket which had their trade goods, these sacred trade goods on their back, and they had a staff with eagle feathers on it that connoted or said who they were. And these same people were known in Aztec cultures as the Tolteca. This is from the Florentine Codex. Same exact idea, same exact type of people. By the way, a lot of this comes from a beautiful PhD thesis by the name of Laura Block, that you can read a lot more detail about this. But anyway, these people in Aztec cultures, they could move throughout the area of Mexico and into the rest of North America without any problem, because people recognized them as sacred bearers. And anyway, so they were kind of a cultural strata below the nobles and above the sort of the hoi polloi were these people that moved back and forth, the Tolteca. So anyway, what were the trade items that these people, that various North American groups remember? What were also yopon leaves, shark's teeth. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make here is they were carrying the kind of stuff that we see carried over long distances. Now, a tale of the Isnissa that the Muskogee tell is that the way they operated, there were two tribes here that were at war with each other. Tribe A hated Tribe B because Tribe B came in, swept through, and caused all kinds of murder and mayhem, and grabbed some of their young girls and took them back as captives. And this had happened years ago. So as Nissa comes to them, he visits and he hears all these stories and said, oh, that's not good. So then he travels down the road to Tribe B here, and he looks around and he sees that those girls that had been captives had been well treated and had married into the tribe in good positions. So he goes back to Tribe A and said, you know, those ones that were kidnapped are actually living pretty good. They're being well treated. And these guys say, oh, well, that's really nice. Let's go make peace with those guys. And so the Isnissa takes them back. And of course, they need to come bearing gifts. And guess who had the gifts? Okay, so these are the stories they tell in their folk tales, which match up with the Aztecs and give you a pretty good idea of how the system could have worked. Not something that we would think of. We think of trade goods, and it is, I want one of those shell ornaments. Here's $50. Get it on a truck and get it to me via Amazon. It was not that kind of a thing. It was more of a sacred thing to them, apparently. At least that would be the inference from ethno-historical data. So anyway, the Bowser Mound, it's the southwestern fringe of early woodlands culture. It is the furthest southwest point that we know of that's tied into that culture. It's under threat for development up around our part of the county. You know, Fulshire is just turning into one large parking lot in some suburbs right now. And we have a group that's trying to save that mound and preserve it with a little prairie around it so that we can remember some of these things that happened. It'll become a state antiquities landmark, and to archaeologists, it's a place of national significance. The other thing I should mention, I first should have mentioned it earlier, all those things, the items from Browser Mound that I came, most of those came out of graves. And all this had happened before there were laws against that. It would be illegal now to do that, to disturb that cemetery.
How many
So-
bodies or burials did you find?
There were about 30 some odd that were excavated. There's probably 50 or 60 bodies there. There's hundreds at the other sites as well. Most of those have been destroyed, those other sites, development, that sort of thing. So anyway, the skeletons for this went to the University of Texas San Antonio, where they reside now in their archaeological lab. And the artifacts that were left with the landowner. And so working with the landowner, she agrees that yes, I won't sell them on eBay. We should put them back down into the ground with the skeleton. So we started that as a process of the Native American Graves Repatriation Act, I think is what it's called. Anyway, there's a whole system of things that you do right that. And what we're trying to do first is save the land first. It doesn't matter if you put them in the ground if it's going to be paved over. And then once you have that, then invite, in this case it'd be the Tonga tribe who set up and said, we'll take care of repatriating the bodies. So that's that. So thank you very much.
Thank you.